good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world. A very warm welcome to the 2020 Wigtown Book Festival. My name is Andrew Blair. I'll be chairing the event this evening. And tonight we're going to be talking to William Sutcliffe about his award-winning YA novel, The Gifted, the Talented, and Me, this is a copy of the book. So this is part of the festival's YA Young Adult Programme, funded by the Hollywood Trust and the Scottish Children's Lottery. But before we're going to talk to William, first let us acknowledge the paradox of hedonism, that in order to pursue pleasure, we must first do admin. So here are some housekeeping rules for the event tonight. This is a YA event. It's a young adult event, so there's a potentially vulnerable audience. So if you're commenting, please think about what you're saying and watch the language. Secondly, if anyone would like to buy the book, there will be a link in the YouTube comments and a button on the Wigtown website homepage. Also, if you're able to, please donate. All support is very welcome, and you can do this again. There will be a link in the YouTube comments and a button on the website homepage. So just to quickly go over how the event will run tonight, we're talking to William imminently for about half an hour, and then there'll be a reading, and then there'll be time after that for audience questions. And the event should last about an hour, and that's it. That's all the admin we have. If you're wanting to send in audience questions, a little bit of admin sneaking in there. If you want to ask any questions, you can send them in by commenting on YouTube. There's a box below the event page on the festival website, and you can also send in a question via any of the festival's social media channels. So that's us now. That's us moving on to the main event. So William Sutcliffe went to Haberdashers' Asks Boys School, meaning he shares a Wikipedia page listing alumni with people such as Simon Sharma, Jason Isaacs, and the co-writer of the film Dirty Grandpa, Dan Mazer. So let's awkwardly segue from that into talking about the book, featuring the fictitious North London Academy for the Gifted and Talented. So, William, hello.
Hello, very nice to be here.
How are you?
Here being at home. Having been to Wigtown, which is always a very long journey, it's nice to be here and also to be at home. But I'm sorry I'm not. Sorry, it's such a shame we're not all in the same room together, because that's such an important part of literary festivals. But I hope the upside of this is that there's maybe an audience in different places who can listen in.
That'd be grand. So just to ease everyone in, talking about the book, just please tell us just a little bit about an outline of the story, the setting of The Gifted, the Talented, and Me.
It's basically about a kid, a very ordinary kid from a very ordinary, boring town, which is just Stevenage in the book, and that's where it all kind of starts. And his father becomes unexpectedly, suddenly wealthy. Sells a business that his son didn't even really know that he had, and moves the whole family to Hampstead, a fancy part of London, and enrolls the three kids in a fictitious North London School for the Gifted and Talented, which is a kind of academy of the sort of performing arts where everybody thinks they're fabulous and talented and brilliant and the next Hollywood star. And the elder brother is a very good musician. The younger sister is a wonderful artist. But the hero of the book, Sam, is just an ordinary kid. He just wants to play football with his mates and doesn't think he's special, doesn't think he's talented. And now suddenly he's landed in this world which is turned upside down, where everything he thought was normal in his previously normal world is weird, and everything that he thought was weird is normal. And he has to decide, does he change himself to fit in with all these people who he finds very pretentious and pleased with themselves, or should he kind of stay true to himself, in which he'll continue to be on the very edges of things and the fringes of things? And that sounds like a kind of serious take on it, but the sort of funny angle of the book is that obviously the setting is sort of ridiculous. It's a very exaggerated version of all the most ridiculous and sort of pretentious people you can imagine. And you sort of, when you're writing comedy, you sort of turn that up. You sort of turn your characters up to 11 to a certain extent to kind of get the humor and to sort of exaggerate them. But I think one of the challenges when you're writing funny books is finding your level of reality. Actually, if you go too far from reality, you just lose your audience. And if you stay too sort of humdrum, then it's not funny. Finding that level of humor where it's a recognizable world, but sort of heightened and funny, that's the challenge. And even as a reader, I enjoy funny books, but I find it very hard to find one that actually sort of makes me laugh. It's quite a difficult area to write in, but those are the books that I sort of really love as a reader, I suppose, whether it's young adult books or adult books. They're books that are funny and also serious at the same time. And that's something I kind of aim for with this.
Grant, continuing with that idea of exaggerating for comic effect, but also keeping it somewhere grounded, so it's not going sailing off into the atmosphere. I want to talk about Sam's mum.
Yeah.
Because she goes on a journey. So the book starts with it's mainly the mum leading the fact that they've got a whole new life in London, but it's not been addressed before. It's just something that arrives one day and is happening. There's no argument about it. And I found that quite interesting because later in the book, because she's doing quite a lot of sort of new age style things, and she's got a sort of lifestyle blog. She's trying different things out, trying to make it fit, and it's quite funny the way it's set up. But there's also a slight undercurrent of she's just trying to find something to make her happy, and it's difficult because her family aren't really going with her. And then there's a serious talk later in the book. So just especially with regards to the mum character, how did you find yourself juggling that balancing act of this is a funny character, but also the bits where you're giving her depth don't appear from nowhere and jar with that?
Yeah, exactly. In some ways, she's sort of the most extreme character in the book, and what she does is kind of ridiculous. In a way, it's a sort of exaggerated version of what he goes through or what she wants for him. There's certainly a sense in the book that she's sort of projecting on her kids. The reason why she wants to send this quite ordinary son to a school for gifted and talented kids is because she has aspirations in that direction. And it's made clear at the start of the book that she's had a job that she doesn't find interesting. And she's like most people, she's been what she considers a wage slave for most of her life. Suddenly this money comes in and she sees this is her opportunity to become the person she's always wanted to be. She doesn't have to go out to work anymore suddenly. And she goes on this slightly ridiculous, what she'd call a sort of creative journey where she tries a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of kind of music and poetry and pottery. And she does all these stuff, and then she does her lifestyle blog. And it's sort of played for laughs in a way. We're sort of laughing at her. But what I don't like in funny books, and I think the point at which I often feel like a book is losing me is if I feel the author is kind of laughing at his characters. Sometimes you get a subtext often in funny books actually of this, the author is this kind of figure floating above the novel, sort of manipulating everybody in a godlike way and laughing at the characters for being idiots, and inviting you, the readers, to say, look at those stupid people, aren't they foolish? And this is all in question of subtext. And that's often there in the subtext in books, and that's something I always strive really hard to avoid. And yes, in some ways we're laughing, but I hope laughing with the characters here. And the mum's journey is sort of a bit ridiculous. In a way, she finds her heart sort of towards the end, in the end, having gone through all these journeys and sort of trying to push her son to be something that he isn't. There's a moment of truth and togetherness towards the end where they both, in a sense, talk each other down. And she realizes actually towards the end of the book that actually work is important to her, and this sort of so-called creative journey that she's on has been a bit of a blind alley. And she needs to go back, and she goes back towards finding some sense of meaningful work that sort of comes out of the more ridiculous things she's been doing, but she sort of finds herself in this way and finds acceptance in the family. And I think through a lot of the book, it's about acceptance in a way. This kid, he wants to be accepted by his family, he wants to be accepted by his friends. And hopefully, I think it was quite important to me that the book, for all the minor characters and every character in the family has their own little journey, a little character arc. So you have your protagonist and the secondary characters, and I hope they all sort of come together and find themselves and find each other in the end in a way that I hope is sort of heartwarming, but also intellectually satisfying, I hope, as well.
Grand. Talking about the start of the book, something I was interested in when reading it, and it chimed with another conversation I was having about with a friend about where stories begin. And obviously, stories have to begin somewhere, but there's always a preamble. There's all this stuff that you don't show. So obviously, we don't see everything prior to this in Sam's life, but I was interested in seeing sort of some of Sam's life in Stevenage, and what I wanted to know was choosing to start the book where you do, the choice that you've made and where you've made it, and the impact it makes on the book, because it just goes straight into it, which just carries you along. So it absolutely makes sense, but there's always that slight thing of wanting a bit more in there with the reader. So I just wanted to ask why you decided to start the book there, and the impact you think that causes as a result.
Yeah, I mean, that's always one of the biggest questions when you're writing any novel, is that choice as to what happens on page one, chapter one. Where do you start? Because obviously your character has a whole life from birth to death, and your story is a certain window within that life. And what is the moment in their life at which the story starts? What's the kind of inciting incident, is the sort of fancy term people often use, that makes the story start? But often the sort of inciting incident, I suppose in this case, is the family suddenly get this windfall and they can move. Obviously the windfall happens because the father has been earning money before that, and the setup before of him being an ordinary kid in an ordinary place and being happy there while his siblings aren't so happy is what you'd call the backstory. But it's only the backstory because I've chosen to start, in a sense, in the middle. But it's one of the key things that sort of you've got to hook especially with younger readers, you've got to hook your audience, and you've got to tell a story. You've got to know what your story is. And in a way, and so actually, if you talk about the strict chronology of the book, it starts with that inciting incident, but there is a backstory I need to fill in, and that comes in quite quickly. I think it comes within the first chapter, actually, quite in the middle of the conversation. I think you probably get about 5 or 6 pages of conversation with the family explaining we can move, we're rich, hooray, and then it flashes back. And then I suppose, and then you get the backstory of how it's all emerged, and also because you've got a young narrator, part of the joke that you can use that's quite a useful tool as a writer when you write about young people, especially sort of young teenage boys, is he's quite sort of self-absorbed.
Yes.
And you can use it when it's a first-person narrative. That's quite a handy device because you're being true to his voice and true to his world vision. If he can say something like, oh, my dad worked on this thing for 5 years, but I don't really know what it was, I didn't notice. And in a way, it's handy because you get the narrative moving, you get the story moving, but it's in character of the person who's telling the story. He's only interested in what's happening to himself, and that what his parents are doing is a blur, even if that's what's sort of generating the action. But I always think you want to get the story moving fast, get the story. And as a writer, I'm interested in story. And it's often sort of undervalued. If you go on a sort of creative writing class, people study creative writing with creative writing teachers. There's a lot of talk about the nitty-gritty of sentences and this, that, and the other, but story is so important, and how you construct a story is hard, and keeping the plot moving. Actually, people often think that it's crime novels that have a good plot, and outside of sort of crime and genre fiction, plot is less important. But actually, I think in the books that I like, in a book like this, in a funny book, there's a lot needs to happen. In each chapter, something needs to happen, and then that needs to create an unsolved problem that's solved in the next problem. The story has to keep turning, and you have to keep a very firm eye on what your story is, and try and keep all the extraneous stuff to a minimum. Keep things moving forward. I think story and pacing are two things that are so knotted in together. I always try and work on those, and I redraft everything again and again and again. And often after a hard day's work, the word count is lower than it was at the beginning, which can make you feel like you haven't done a lot. But actually, some of that work is the most important work there is, because you're making it tighter.
So writing is rewriting. It's the phrase
absolutely.
you occasionally get. Yeah. So that sort of chimes in with the fact the book is very much, it's all filtered through Sam. And I get this impression he's not a completely reliable narrator. I don't know if you've ever, I mean, there's countless examples of that fiction. The one that's popped into my head most recently is the sitcom Ghosts, that's on iPlayer at the moment, has got an episode which is multiple viewpoints of the same incident, kind of thing. It's really good. I recommend it. But what you were just talking about, that lends itself to the idea that this is all from Sam's point of view, and in focusing on that and keeping everything in that ballpark, that sort of covers my next question. Were you ever tempted to include a chapter from someone else's perspective to give a different angle on events, or is it very important for you to focus on Sam?
I think you can't. I think if you got a first person narrative, you can't. You have to stick with that. You can't jump. I mean, you could do it sort of 50-50 or a third equal, but you can't just jump out briefly and then jump back in. Just structurally, that would be all wrong. It wouldn't work. But having said that, just because you got a first person narrative doesn't mean there isn't also an authorial voice, actually. I think a skillful author with a first person narrator, all the sentences, all the vocabulary, all the ideas have to fit with what your narrator is saying. But you can say quite a lot between the lines. And sometimes, quite often, especially in a funny or comedic first-person narration with an unreliable narrator, the author is kind of speaking directly to the reader over the characters' heads. So the example I just gave of him, the character saying Dad was doing such and such, I didn't really notice. In a way, that's a private joke between the author and the reader that the character doesn't notice. I'm sort of saying directly to the reader, look at this kid, he's quite oblivious to what's going on around him. And there's a lot in the story, even though he's telling the story, there's a lot in the story that you as a reader will get that the character won't necessarily get, particularly in terms of some of the themes, because you're encouraged as a reader to, I mean, he's quite an unreflective character, but obviously when you're reading a novel, the author is inviting you to think about what's happening to the characters in the book, possibly harder than the characters are thinking about their own lives. And I said at the beginning that what interests me is books that are funny and serious. And there is a serious side to this book, which is something the character is probably completely oblivious of, which relates to the sort of title of the book, The Gifted and the Talented and Me, which in a sense, the novel is a satire of a whole sort of cultural phenomenon, in a sense, which I think is very prevalent at the moment, which is the way society has changed over the last, particularly accelerating in the last 5 years, with everybody feeling that sort of being gifted and talented is increasingly important. And that we're reaching this point in the world where it's almost as if everybody wants to be on stage and nobody wants to be in the audience anymore. And I think as people blame everything on social media, I think a lot of it comes from social media. A lot of it actually, to a certain extent, also comes from TV talent shows, I think. The idea that everybody wants to be famous, that is what seems to be most respected and admired in our society now, is being on stage, getting a big round of applause. And thanks to social media, it's as if we can all be on our little mini stages. And anytime anybody posts something on social media, they're hoping for some likes and for an increased number of followers, which in a sense is another form of a round of applause. Obviously, a round of applause is only meaningful if there's a group of people applauding you. It's as if we're all wanting an audience. And there's a sense that I think there's the sort of dignity of other forms of work is sort of being lost in a way, and this rush to admire and worship performance, in a sense, and everybody feeling under pressure to be special and to be fabulous in some way or other. So underneath it all, this book is quite a serious sort of satire on that aspect of all our lives, and particularly how it affects young people who I think more susceptible to these kind of pressures. And in a way, the journey the character goes on is he's sort of young and happy, oblivious to all of this stuff, and then by getting sucked into the world of the book, well, these characters are really obsessed with that. He gets sucked in and he feels he has to get validation as a person according to that worldview. And then what he comes to learn towards the end of the book is that actually the point he started from in the beginning is better. Meaningful, one-to-one, in-person relationships are where you get validation as a human being that means something, that can actually lead you to happiness. And wanting to be in the spotlight, being admired by hundreds of people is not really a path to happiness. And that's what he kind of learns. And that's why I hope it's a book for young people, also a book for adults as well. I think it's something that adults will relate to, parents will relate to. I think all of us, to a certain extent, were afflicted by that. And in a way, this North London Academy for the Gifted and Talented, which is a fictional school I've invented, in a way, that fictional place is Twitter, it's Instagram, it's a sort of fantasy place where we all are in an extent. All these people competing to be loud, noisy, special, popular. That school is a little microcosm of what's happening to the world, I think.
Well, it's interesting you've added in this to a coming of age story, this social satire aspect, because I was wanting to say something along the lines. Coming of age stories they've been around for I don't know however long communication's been around for, and there's been similarities noted with this book and Adrian Mole, which was sort of one of the books that I say didn't directly influence it. It was influenced in terms of you were looking to make a book that would make people laugh in the YA category, due to a dearth of books of that kind. Yeah. And I was thinking about it, and I was just thinking, when I was a teenager, once I'd read Adrian Mole, and I think my dad said, "Oh, okay, well, here's Hitchhikers, Guide to the Galaxy." After that, it was pretty much those aren't necessarily teenage books. The category didn't exist per se in those days, but all the books that I read with that sort of coming of age aspect were in the fiction section. They weren't aimed at teenagers, and it's quite interesting to see a difference now in sort of YA fiction is in this. I've noticed you're able to make a teenage boy, I mean, not as accurately horny as he would be, but pretty close. Like, that's definitely a difference from when I was a teenager. That was not getting through. So I just wanted to check with you whether there was any issues in terms of being that frank about just how, I don't know, just the sort of level of sort of sexual content. It's not like it's explicit or anything.
It's not a rude book. I mean, it's not.
No, it's not a rude book.
It's funny. I've written.
It's the fact that he's just so clearly horny, and that's not shied away from at all. Was quite. I just found that quite refreshing, because that's not something that I grew up with, and I think that might be a change in publishing.
I think there's a fair amount of that in Adrian Mole as well. There's a limit to what he can do about it, but it's certainly there in your. If you're going to write accurately about teenage boys, it's there in your head. And the character in this book doesn't really get anywhere with women. It's all in his head, mainly. I mean, he gets But I don't want to give away too much of the plot for anyone who hasn't read it, but it's certainly not a kind of sexual book. I mean, I have written young adult books for older readers, which have got some more sort of mature content in it, if you like. But in a way, I feel like this is sort of 12 plus probably, but right up to adults, I hope, as well, because I sort of think it's about what I like about Adrian Mole and Hitchhikers to an extent. And in a way, what makes me nostalgic for that era is that young adult books didn't exist. I mean, the books existed, but the marketing category didn't exist. It was just a book. And when Adrian Mole came out, I read it. Everybody of my age read it, teenagers, and all our mums read it as well. And it wasn't like I was reading an adult book or they were reading a children's book. It was just a book. It's about a teenager. And in a way, it makes me sad that the categorization of marketing is if you write a book about a teenager, it'll be a young adult book. And then adults are sadly getting the message, oh, this isn't for you. When I think it is. I mean, I've written children's books, young adult books, and adult books. I've written in all three genres. And you do have to put a different hat on when you're writing a children's book for small children, for kind of 8 to 12s, because they see the world so differently. And there's your vocabulary has to be a bit different because it has to be understandable. You have to constantly think, will they understand this? Will they get it? But once the kids are above 12, the kind of will they get it doesn't really apply that much, actually. I'm still, as I would be when writing for adults, I'm thinking I'm writing for myself, essentially. And I don't really think my process is really any different when I'm writing a young adult book to writing an adult book. The only difference really tends to be the age of the protagonist, actually.
Okay. With the coming of age aspect mentioned previously, because it is something of an established story form, does that give you any pressure in terms of this is my version of this story that is extremely popular and is just some of the sort of most popular fiction in the world? Do you feel any pressure when you're tackling that, or is it a kind of, this is my go at it, this is my go, I'm gonna revel in all the kind of trappings and tropes of it?
Well, essentially, I think coming of age is a term that gets used an awful lot about books about young people particularly. But to be honest, I think actually all decent books ever written are coming of age books, actually, really, whether about adults or young. But if you think about what's the definition of a coming of age book, and when it comes to young people, it's about a book, a coming of age novel, I suppose, would be one where somebody is immature, young, a child. At the beginning, they go through an experience, they learn from it, and they become more mature and they know more as a result. They have come of age, they become a bit more adult. But actually, if you're writing any book, if it's any good, any book in which the characters are not changed by their experience isn't much of a book, to be honest. Your story hasn't gone anywhere, hasn't done anything. If your protagonist is still exactly the same at the end and nothing they've been through has touched them, then they haven't changed and your story hasn't really achieved anything. It's not going to be a very interesting book. So if your character is 32 at the beginning of a book and 33 at the end of a book, then in a sense it's a coming of age. And if they're changed by what they go through in those 12 months, they've come of age in a certain extent. But it's just that if your character's going from 12 to 13 or 13 to 14, there's a tendency to think, oh, they were a child, now they're an adult, they've come of age, as if it's a threshold that happens once in your life. But I think all decent stories make their characters sort of come of age in a sense. And your characters learn something, what's happened to them, and they change and develop. And I think whatever age your character is. So in a way, I sort of cling on to that coming of age things. I've often thought, yes, I'm writing coming of age novels. And then this kind of idea occurred to me. I thought, no, everything is a coming of age novel. And if it isn't, you need to think harder about your story and maybe come up with a better story.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense in terms of I suppose it's like a YA being a marketing category. Coming of age is a term that is applied to a story that's effectively happens at all ages, but it's just for the sort of teenage market.
And I think for that age group, just going back to what you picked up on, what you said before about humour, and about Adrian Mole and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's very true. That was exactly the experience that made me want to write this book. It all started with when my son was ill and he was in bed and he just wanted a funny book to read. He didn't want sort of doom and gloom and death and disaster and dystopia. And we went to our local bookshop and they suggested those two books, and they said, well, if he's read that, there isn't much else. And that's when I thought, actually, I started writing funny books for adults. Then I wrote books for young adults, which tended to be quite serious. And I just thought, well, why? Why don't I bring these two halves together and write something funny for young adults? Because I'd observed, especially with my son, he's a teenager now, he's old, he's 17 now, he was quite a few years younger when I started writing this book. And it's, even though the books for that age group often are very dark and gloomy, he certainly isn't dark and gloomy. Yes, teenagers are up and down, but I think he has much more fun than I do. He laughs more than I do. When his friends come round, they have much more than a laugh than I think I do with my friends. So why are the books so sort of doomy? I think at that age, there's so much laughter and almost hysteria in the book. If you can tap 1/10 of that and get it on the page, then you've got something that's a lot funnier than most adult lives.
Grand. I think we've got time for sort of one more question from myself, and then we'll go for a reading. And question sort of relates slightly to when I was saying the books I was reading as a teenager that had that sort of journey of immaturity through to maturity were mainly for older readers. So I remember reading or seeing the film High Fidelity around that age. So there's a line in that, did I listen to pop music because I was miserable, or was I miserable because I listened to pop music? And that's something that's sort of I've been pondering relating to fiction aimed at well, everyone really, but especially teenagers. So what I'm going to ask is, did you write your characters in this book that way because that's what teenage boys are like, or do you feel like there's an element of teenage boys are like that because that's how they see themselves reflected in fiction that they consume?
I don't know, I tried to be accurate. I don't think I could have written this book based just on my memories of being a teenager. Having a teenage boy in the house was important kind of research in a sense. The character isn't very much isn't him, I should be clear. But just knowing him and his friends and seeing how they talk to each other, and that also bringing back some of my memories of being that age and remembering how funny it is, and just sort of realizing how the humor and the seriousness are really entwined, actually. I think that's quite interesting at that age. In a way, at that age, everything's very funny and everything's very serious, because it does feel like there's a lot at stake. And when your friendships go wrong and your friendship groups shift and somebody turns against you or something like that, or break your heart over a girl, or these things loom so large, and you can move so quickly from being really upset to really happy. And you can also flick from quite adult concerns and adult feelings to just wrestling with your brother on the ground and pulling their hair and just being a baby, if you see what I mean. And that flicking between states is very interesting at that age and sort of funny. And as also as a writer, I think it's sort of comedic gold dust. And the other fascinating thing I found as a parent is realizing there's this way that teenagers think and communicate, and then they're stuck in a house with these middle-aged parents who have this very other worldview. And the gulf in worldview between a teenage boy and a middle-aged woman, mother, particularly struck me as something very funny that can be mined. Even when there's a lot of love and care and concern there, there's just these two totally different languages and set of concerns, and they're locked into each other's lives and they love each other, but they could be these comets moving in totally different directions. And that's something you're always looking for as a writer of comedy, I think. These sort of powerful forces heading in different directions, bumping into each other, misunderstanding each other, all of that sort of comedic gold dust. So that was the other thing that I was excited about, sort of tapping into something I really haven't seen that much on the page, actually. A funny but also true and real portrait of teenage guys and their mothers. And I think if done right, what I was always aiming for, hoping for, was something that's sort of true and has a heart and feels real at the same time as being sort of funny and ridiculous. I didn't want to just keep sort of turning that dial up to sort of 11, 12, 13 to constantly go for more and more jokes. Because sometimes that sort of sitcom style writing, you turn it up, gag, but you don't really believe in them as people anymore. And I think you want more from a novel than that. So you have to keep it quite balanced. I always want to keep them very real at the same time as keeping them funny.
And so, like, the best sitcoms have that element of people being trapped together, but there's enough pathos in there to make you care about the characters rather than regard them as just sort of vehicles for gags.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the difference. And it's a sort of invisible line, and you know you're on the right side of it, and you know you're on the wrong side of it, and it's another world. And there are these shows that you can really cherish because you feel you know and understand those people, and you believe in them. Even something like Seinfeld, for example, is very unreal. The plots are ridiculous and totally implausible, but you believe in them. There's some level, as people, you just believe in them. The people feel real, and they could be something very similar. And it just crosses that threshold. And you just think, don't believe it, don't care.
Yeah, there's definitely, if you've watched comic book movies, straddle that problem a lot. Anything where it's something inherently ridiculous, like a man dressing up as a bat to fight crime, and then you have the successful versions of that either revel in it or overcome that and come up with a version of reality where it makes sense. Thank you.
That's about consistency. You can make, if you're good enough writer, you can make anything seem real. But every reader or consumer of an art, of TV or film, you believe it or you don't. And you have to invent your own rules for each thing you write. And there isn't really a rule book for it, actually. But you just have to put yourself in the feet of the reader or the viewer and know where your world starts and stops and stay inside the boundaries of the bit of what's real. And sometimes you'll think of a good joke or a good line and you'll think, no, that's just gone outside the bubble. That's bursting the bubble. This person couldn't say that. It's a joke, but that works, but that person couldn't say it. It's obviously come from me, the author in my study, not that person in that place. And those all have to go. And if you don't do that, it's like a bubble bursting. It's all over it. It stops working.
That's all the questions from me. So now it's time for a reading. So just hand over to you.
Right, okay. I'm going to read. I'm going to try and figure out how to read from the book without covering up the whole camera and disappearing. Might be just a little face peering over the top. So I'm going to read a little bit from... I'm trying to remember how much we've described of the book. He moves from Stevenage to the School for the Gifted and the Talented, where his elder brother and younger sister are delighted to be, and he has no desire to be there. And this is a little bit from his sort of first day at school. This is when he meets his teacher for the first time. So hopefully it shouldn't need too much preamble. After a while, a bearded man walked in. This is in the classroom on the first day, wearing brown corduroys and a white smocky shirt type thing with a neckline low enough to reveal a hairy tuft of man cleavage. At first, I assumed he must be the teacher, but nobody stood up or greeted him or stopped chatting, and he didn't seem to mind, so I began to think perhaps he wasn't. He walked over to me and said, "So, you're Sam," extending a clenched hand as though he was attempting to greet me with a fist bump. I put both hands in my pockets by way of a response. "I'm Mr. Phillips, but just call me Tony," he said. I nodded and tried to smile, concluding that this really was, despite all evidence to the contrary, the teacher. "Shy?" he asked, clapping me on the shoulder. There is nothing in this world more likely to make me feel shy, someone asking me if I feel shy, even though I don't actually think I am particularly shy. So I instinctively wanted to respond to this with something loud and shameless just to prove I wasn't shy, but in the end I didn't, because I was too shy. Don't be, he said in response to my non-answer. This is a friendly place. Don't think of it as a school. Think of it as a laboratory of curiosity. Which is my desk? I asked, meaning, please, can we end this conversation? Take your pick, he said. We have a non-territorial approach here. Some people find that hard to get used to. I'll have this one then. Do you mean have or use? I don't know. Hey, don't look so worried. This is just the beginning. Rome wasn't built in a day. I nodded, attempting to give the impression that I understood what he was talking about. So, what's your thing? He said, perching one buttock on the corner of the desk I had just claimed. My thing? Drama, music, dance, football, I said. The smirk that seemed to permanently curl up one corner of his mouth froze. You're kidding, right? No, why would I be kidding? Listen, Sam, it's perfectly natural at your age to want to challenge authority. I respect that. It can be a very healthy thing, and in a permissive environment, it can be hard to find outlets for that urge. Am I right? No, I just like football. Listen, if there's one word I hate using in this classroom, it's rules. That's not how we operate. But your parents must have told you something about our pedagogical ethos, right? Pedagogical what-os? We have a child-centered, non-hierarchical framework here. There are just a few things we insist on. Mutual respect, inclusiveness, and no football. What? Kicking is a violent act. We've found that it increases aggression and accentuates gender stereotyped behavior. Ball games are fine up to a point, as long as they're not competitive, but football is out. Football and smoking. Though we usually turn a blind eye to smoking. But, okay, it's registration time. We can talk more later, Sam. Don't sweat it. Everybody loves this place eventually. It'll be the making of you. He stood and began to clap, not to applaud his own wonderfulness, at least not entirely, but to quieten the class. Listen up, guys, it's register. Is anyone not here? There was no discernible response. Okay, cool. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you all had a good summer. It's fantastic to see you all again. I'm sure you've all got a million stories, triumphs, disasters, breakthroughs, and breakdowns. Only kidding. Anyway, can't wait to hear what you've all been up to. It's great to be back in the saddle again. Not literally. Only kidding. Anyway, we'll have to catch up on news later because it's first period now, but I want you all to say hi to Sam here. He's new to our strange and amazing ways. Fresh blood? Only kidding. Anyway, he's come here from mainstream education, so this is all completely new to him and probably kind of frightening and hard to keep up with. Like a battery hen released in a forest. Only kidding. Anyway, I need some help to help him out, someone to help him out and guide him through the first few days. So who's going to be Sam's buddy? I looked around the class, who were all concentratedly avoiding eye contact with the teacher, as if this question had suddenly made the walls, floor, and ceiling fascinating to look at. No volunteer? Okay, it'll have to be you then, Darius. Why me? Said a boy in skinny jeans, so skinny they were basically just denim tights. His hair seemed to have been meticulously gelled in at least 7 different directions, and he was wearing glasses with frames so chunky and hideous they could only be expensive and highly fashionable. Because of your charm and diplomacy, said Just Call Me Tony, as Darius rolled his eyes and chucked his bag on the floor, mouthing what looked like a stream of obscenities. Okay, that's that then. See you all later, guys. Peace out. Within seconds, the room emptied, apart from me and Darius. I looked at him, read his T-shirt a couple of times. It said, T-shirt slogans are so last year, and thought, who is this freak? He looked back at me, his eyes travelling up and down over my short, ungelled hair, my grey hoodie and sagging jeans, and I saw on his face an expression that clearly seemed to say, "Who is this freak?" For some reason, I got the feeling that to speak first would be conceding defeat, so I just stared at him. He stared back. I soon realised I was never going to win. Darius looked like the kind of kid who could go a week without speaking, or blinking, or eating. "So you're Darius," I said, reluctantly. "Yep." "Where do we go now?" "Follow me." And that's where we'll stop.
Thank you very much. We've got some questions coming from the audience. So first up, are there any authors which really stand out for you that you think have inspired your writing?
Oh God, there's so many. I honestly don't know where to start. I think I've been doing this for quite a long time, about 20 years, and I've met a lot of authors over the years, and there's such a complicated and diverse bunch of people. They're all very different, so different. And I think there's only two things they have in common, actually, as people. One is that they're all sort of very determined. The quality you need to get to write an entire book. I mean, actually, to just get one draft of a book done isn't that hard, just to cover that words. But to go back and do it again and again and again until it's right takes an incredible amount of determination and dedication. So they're all, the only thing I found in common, they're all determined and they're all readers. They're all avid readers. Nobody ever wrote a book without being a sort of committed reader and reading not just kind of for work, but for fun. It has to sort of be your passion. So I've been reading and reading and reading sort of all my life, adult books, young adult books, children's books, everything. But I would say the two things that really inspired me to want to write for young adults, firstly, it was having teenager in the house. Having children and teenagers in the house made me remember that phase of life more, and want to sort of write books for them. I suddenly began to see the sort of slightly gaps in the bookshelves, which wasn't fulfilling what they were interested in, and beginning to see the world through their eyes and understand them more made me want to write young adult books. So in terms of young adult books, I think the book that inspired me, I think, to take up young adult fiction was probably Holes by Louis Sahar, which just struck me as just a fantastic work of literature, really. And I don't see it in any sort of subset, sort of children's fiction, whatever that means. I think just by any count, it's just a brilliant work of fiction. Just as a writer, it just hits everything you could want in a book, and the level of skill in the writing, the way he puts sentences together, the way he constructs character and story, it's just brilliantly done, and the ideas in it are so good. And when I read that, I realized that you can do, within the bracket of young adult fiction, you can do almost anything, and in terms of, and no writer was sort of too good for it, in a sense.
That partly answers some of the other questions. Someone's asked, what advice would you give to younger writers? And you covered some of that with sort of reading voraciously and the determination aspect. Is there anything else you would add to that?
The other thing is, I think one of the most intimidating things about, you're reading novels and loving them and thinking, I want to do that, which is where we all start. I mean, we're all readers before we're writers. You think, I want to do that, and then you pick up this thing and you riffle through all the pages and you think, it's so long. I mean, there's so much work went into that. How can I possibly do that? And it's easy to be intimidated by that, just the size of the task. So as with a lot of things in life, actually, the same with studying for an exam or any sort of or learning a musical instrument, same thing with any big task. If you just have your eyes on the finishing line, it seems really daunting and impossible. So the advice I would give is forget the finishing line. Just think about the process. If you want to write, don't think about the big, long thing you're aiming at. Think about the process, trying to enjoy the process, make it something you enjoy. And just get some pen and paper or open up a word processor and just do it without worrying about what it is, without worrying about what anyone else might think of you. Don't even tell anyone you're doing it. Don't worry about where it's going to end up or how you're going to finish it. To get started, which is often the hardest challenge, just start. Don't worry about what it is. Start with any idea, and you don't even need to start with the first chapter or the first line of the story. Anything that interests you, you can start in the middle of a piece of dialogue without even explaining who the characters are. You know, even for me, when I write a novel, I don't necessarily start at the beginning. I might start with a scene that captures my imagination and build backwards and forwards. So just start, dive in, and try and enjoy it. And if you're enjoying it, then you will find the stamina to do it. And it might turn into a short story, and then it might turn into a long story or a novella or a novel. But you worry about that as you're doing it. So just dive in, do it, enjoy it. That's how to start, I think.
Grand. I'm going to combine two questions here, and you've touched on these before in previous answers. So how did the ideas for the main character Sam come about, and also do you see yourself in any of the characters? Has writing these characters taught you anything about yourself or your younger self?
It's always interesting to kind of do you see yourself in the characters? Because in a way, I think it might sound like I'm sort of dodging the question, but in a way, what's always true is that you're none of the characters and you're all of the characters in a sense, because you have to think your way into the head of all your characters, particularly more than anything your narrator, obviously, because you have to think your way in your head into his head to get your worldview. So you have to remember back to what it is like to be that age. But part of the art of being a writer is making things happen in your head to other people via experiences you have or a worldview that you have. And it's very hard to pin down to in what sense it is and isn't you. And then obviously when you're writing a dialogue scene, just to make the dialogue plausible and real, even if the other character in the piece of dialogue isn't the narrator, you have to get into their head to think, what would this person say to react? So any character who speaks in a book, you have to get into their head. So you have to be able to get into everybody's head. So I think I wouldn't say this is an autobiographical novel at all. But there's elements of observation in it. Obviously, living with a teenager, having once been a teenager. And also people think about autobiography as, is that person you, or did those things happen to you? But there's a whole other level, in a sense that the only novel you can write is a book that's about a subject it takes so much time. It has to be something that's really uppermost in your mind, something you care about. So in a way, you can say that the themes of a novel are sort of autobiographical in a way. So as I was saying about social media and the pressure on people to perform, the pressure on people to have this kind of public face via social media, that urge, the need to perform, and that push to be somebody special. In a way, there's an autobiographical element in that. It's just something that I observe and trying to parent my children. It's a topic I'm concerned about in terms of just the world I know. So in a way, that's the autobiographical element in a sense, and that it's not about creating a version of me. It's not about describing things that have happened to me, but it's about funneling my concerns. It's about funneling the things that I care about and the things that I'm interested in through fictitious characters and fictitious situations that I've created to get to a truth, which is something that is sort of in my heart about how I feel about the world, and something I want to communicate, particularly to young people. This kind of just just to acknowledge that there's this pressure on you to be something, to perform, to be something you may not want to be, and to help maybe give people the strength to think, no, you can resist that. You don't have to You don't have to be that. You don't have to spend your evenings in search of likes on social media sites. There are other things that are more important.
And I think we've got time to fit in one last question. So we've got here, what message do you want to send to your audience through your work? And that ties in a little bit with what you were just saying.
Yeah, I think I tied that in with the last thing was sort of I sort of rambled on until I accidentally telepathically answered the question you're about to ask. But yeah, I think that's the main thing I want to say in this book. I mean, partly via wanting to write a funny book is to communicate, as well as what I've just said, the more serious thing about social media and all of that stuff. I won't repeat myself. About wanting to write a funny book is just to remind people that books are entertainment. They're not homework. And I, as a reader, want funny books. I, as a parent, want my son to read funny books because he enjoys comedy, and I don't want my son and his friends and teenagers in general to grow up thinking that books are sort of homework, something you read to be miserable, or in the manner of a sort of textbook, and that then when you want to relax, you put on the TV. I want reading to be something people do for pleasure and enjoyment and fun. And then sometimes for me as an adult, sometimes that's reading funny books, sometimes reading serious books, sometimes it's reading nonfiction. But it all originally comes from that enjoyment in books. And sometimes people can think serious books are important and funny books are light and sort of throwaway in a sense. But I don't see it that way at all. I'm hoping that this book, by just being entertaining, being enjoyable, it's a book, you read it fast, you enjoy it, it makes you laugh. And I think fingers crossed, if the book does that, then it does something important. That's what I really wanted to set out to do. And if it gives somebody the sort of joy of reading who wasn't a reader beforehand and makes them want to go on to read other books, then I couldn't want for anything more than that.
Fantastic. That is all from us tonight. Sorry to anyone who didn't get their question read out. We ran out of time, I'm afraid. Again, if anyone wants to buy the book, there's a link in the YouTube comments and a button on the website homepage. And of course, please support your local bookshops where possible. And if you're able to donate to Wigtown to help keep the festival going, you can do that via link in the comments on YouTube or button on the website. So just remains to say thank you to Andy Stewart and Kirsty at Wigtown, Sandy and the tech team, Abby and Chris, everyone helping behind the scenes, the Hollywood Trust, Scottish Children's Lottery. My name's Andrew Blair. That's not really important, but I thought I'd mention it again. And
thank you, Andrew, for doing such a great job. It was lovely to talk to you.
Lovely talking to you, and thank you, of course, to William Sutcliffe. Thank you very much, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.